Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, you know me. My name is Dr. Keith McNally. This is the Question Guy podcast. I'm here with Lyn Green, and she is going to tell us an amazing story. Now, all of us have an identity. Some of us don't find our true identity until much later in life. And so the process of really discovering that within ourselves, whatever it takes, is typically a journey within itself. Lyn is here to talk about her journey and how she found herself. Lyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am truly grateful for this opportunity.
Well, let's make this the best opportunity possible. I want this to be the best podcast you've ever been on.
It's done.
Where do we start this conversation? So where did you grow up?
Yes. Wow, that's a loaded question. So I I was born in Puerto Rico. We soon moved to the Dominican Republic, which is where my family is from, the Dominican Republic. And by the age of three or so, we moved to Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island. I would like to say, as far as where I grew up, that was a very pivotal time in our life. Having migrated from the Dominican Republic, we lived there for 7 years, and thereafter we did some bouncing back and forth. So I kind of grew up a little bit of everywhere, from there to Miami to New Jersey, then back down to Florida.
That's a lot of cultural shock in many different ways. And that will definitely have an impact of how you see yourself. And so I've got to dive in a little bit deeper. So because you're a lot of this conversation is going to focus on you, family of origin. So
Yeah.
truly, how many people are in your family of origin growing up? And
Mm.
brothers, sisters, mom, dad, kind of give us a scope.
Yeah, so within my immediate family, we're three sisters and a brother. And I'll explain, there's an interesting dynamic to my little sister, who's actually my niece. But my mother raised us as siblings because we were so close together. But I talk a little bit about that within my book, and there's so many people that I've talked to that have similar circumstances. There's, nieces that grow up so close together to their aunts that, calling me auntie was not going to happen in her eyes. But yeah, so that's the bulk of my siblings, my mother and father. We come from a very large family. My mother and her siblings she's one of 11. And so I have a lot of cousins as well, from the Dominican Republic to, here in the States.
So you said you moved up and down. So where exactly did you settle for most of your kind of growing up? I guess, from seven to your teenage years. Where were
Um,
you?
in Miami, um, so the way the timeline is broken down is I learned English in Rhode Island. We came here. I didn't know a hint of English when we moved here. And so that was elementary to middle. And middle to high, portions of high school, I lived in Florida. And then, correction, no, to middle school, I was in Florida. And then I started high school in New Jersey. And I finished high school back in Florida. So, so
Well,
there you
it almost seems like your family was part of the military, but that's probably far from the
have.
truth.
I get that all the time because every time people ask me about, where I grew up, that's always the conversation. And that's the first comment I get is, were you guys a part of the military?
Yeah, it's
No.
typical. And I attach myself to that because I'm a US Marine. But what we know about you is you became this little girl, a perfectionist. You were very much needing to control your life because everything on the external world was very much out of your control. So can you kind of talk to us about how you developed into this personality?
Absolutely. Yes. So, coming into the United States, we did, as many migrant families did, just try to figure out, how do we manage? Where do we start? Obviously, our residence was the most important thing. And so we did have a wonderful home in Providence, Rhode Island. But everything after that had to be discovered. In the midst of us transitioning, there were issues within my family with regard to my brother's drug use, and the conflict that created within the home, primarily as it related to my mother's response to it. So there were a lot of things that were happening around us that we could see that my mother wouldn't speak of, but it was obvious we knew something was going on. And I felt in those early years, because I saw her go through such a difficult time, that I needed to be the child that did not give her a difficult time. So, how would I do that? I would do everything great. I would make sure I'd go to school, I'd make good grades, I'd make her proud. And so that's where it was born. That's where that seed was planted within me.
So, as that seed grows inside of you, how do you find yourself interacting with mom, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins? How do you see yourself? So, this is a two-part question. How do you see yourself? How do they, if you kind of give some introspection, how do they see you?
Hmm. I was always the serious child. And that pretty much carried me on into the rest of my life. I've always been a serious person, very focused, very determined. There was a lot of suppression of a lot of those maybe playful moments that I wish I had had more of, because I was so focused on the end goal, which was just to make sure that my mother was happy. And so, even though, of course, as a child, I did have those moments, I know that everyone saw me, as even as a kid, as the responsible kid. My mother would describe me to other people when she would introduce us as the serious one. And so that's pretty much how my personality just continued to be that way. That was always the focus. Um, as far as how I saw those around me, um, I felt like everyone was always in need, you know, and whether I felt like I was looking for that to be able to feel validated, I always felt like there was something I could do to help other people. I mean, even to include, my sister struggled with her Spanish, I mean, with her English, coming into the States. I actually picked it up pretty quickly, very well. But she was struggling, and even I would read her books and do her book reports. So I'm sure
She,
she loved that.
we
But
won't tell anybody.
yes, yes, yes.
So, how does your relationship with your mother develop over all of these years? Because your book is about her, your internal focus is around her and how that relationship kind of grew,
Yeah.
whether healthy or in a very non-healthy manner.
Hmm.
Can you
Hmm.
talk about that?
Yeah. So, um, through the years, my relationship with my mother was fine until it wasn't. Right? There's that saying, everything is great until it isn't. Um, because as far as I was willing to do whatever I needed to do to make sure she was okay, everything was great. When I started growing up and I started realizing that there were certain boundaries that were being crossed, and now my opinions needed to be heard, or the way I felt needed to be heard in a different way than as a child. We were taught to just, you know, say nothing, accept everything your parents tell you to do, be seen and not heard. That was always the understanding. So as you get older and you grow into your adolescence and you start developing, you have different thought processes and things that are important to you, and when those things are not respected, you become a little vocal. Um, so during that time, we did have a bit of a strained relationship, and that's what I speak of in my book is that relationship that was so conflicted that in turn started to become an aching pain in my heart because I couldn't understand why, if I had been this amazing child, were we having these issues.
So let's dive in a little bit deeper. Can you touch on maybe what one of those issues may be, just to give clarification to the conflict so that our
Yeah.
audience can understand your perspective and maybe even your mother's perspective?
Yes. The biggest obstacle for us has always been her being so concerned about my brother and his challenges that she kind of was not present in our lives and in those things that were important to us. And so he always was priority. And what pained us about that was, and me especially, was that I can see it was sucking the life out of her. And so, at the core, since I've always just wanted her to be happy, I couldn't understand why, number one, this was going to continue for the rest of her life because she was having troubles creating boundaries even with him. And then how it in turn was affecting us as a family because she was not creating that space for us and creating that room for us because she was so concerned about what's been going on with him.
So I'm going to do some fast forward and then I'm going to come back a bit. So you did finish high school, yes?
Did.
And
Mhm.
did you go off to college?
I did. I went off to college. And I did not go to my college graduation. Interesting story. Yes, from a person who was very dedicated, and it was a very proud moment for me. In fact, I was the first to graduate within my family with a 4-year degree. At that time, I've since gotten my master's, but I did. I graduated high school. I went to college. Didn't attend my college graduation, but I did attend my master's graduation.
So what happened at college?
In college, so my focus going into college was again providing for my family,
Okay.
doing what I could because at that time my father was no longer with us. It was no longer staying with us. My mother and he was separated, and so I took on the role of the main breadwinner of the family. I was in a senior in high school at the time, but I was the only one with employment within my home. And so when it came, well, when we moved to Miami, is what I'm saying. I was a senior in high school. And so my focus through that senior year was just trying to get something that can help provide for my family. I was going to pick hospitality because we lived in Miami, tourism. I said this was perfect. It's a short career, it's a short span within my college education, and I can get right to work. And that was the idea. Um, in my heart of hearts, since I was a little girl, I have always liked to serve people, right? Public servant at heart. And so I knew that I needed to be in that space. But thank goodness for college registration administrators who look at you and say, "Are you sure you want to do that hospitality?" And criminal justice is where I landed. Yeah.
So it's still kind of the same. You're still kind of helping people, but just in a different way.
Yes, yes.
So with all that going on, and you still see yourself as this person in need of helping others, because it's kind of what we're developing, and very much a perfectionist in the way that you go about it, there's still this emptiness, I have to assume, because you're really not knowing who you are. So let's transition this conversation into your journey, because this is where we've got to get to. And this is what people have come to this conversation to listen to. Your
Yes.
journey is so important. Your healing journey is so important. The book that you created from that healing journey is so important. Where did that healing journey begin?
Yes. So it started with the final hang up call that my mother made, or that my mother did to me. We were having a conversation, and it was in one of those deep moments where I was just pained by the way the conversation was going, and I expressed that, and she didn't like what I was expressing to her at the time. She hung up on me, which she did often. Um, when she did not want the conversation to go, in a certain direction. And so in that moment, I realized I had to make a change,
Mm.
because that moment broke my heart to the core. I can't even describe the pain, because again, I've done everything I can possibly do. I'm there when she needs me. I am the according to her the most responsible child. I've gone to school. I've stayed out of trouble. I built a career. I've gotten married. All these things that are important within our culture. You get married. You get a job. You buy a house. You have a kid. I've done it all. And after that moment, I realized that there really isn't anything more that I can do. And so that for me was the moment, that aha moment, that I realized this is where we are. So where do we go from here? You cannot go any further trying to win her love by your, or her validation by your accomplishments, or by the things that you do. So where now? And so that's where my healing journey began. My spiritual journey, I really sought some counseling, and therapy is amazing when it comes to processing a lot of those deep rooted hurts. So that's where it started for me.
So, what does your healing journey consist of? So, you just spoke about therapy and you touched on the idea of spirituality. Who are you and what are you becoming in terms of your healing?
Mhm. I am whole. I would love to say I finally feel whole. Um, I my healing journey began with, like I said, just taking a step back and just like really feeling the emotions, and because it was those emotions that were going to lead me to healing, and I knew that. But for so long, we try sometimes to suppress these things that we don't want to feel, but we have to in order to get to that next step. And so that was the most difficult part of that process, was knowing that in order to get there, I had to seek some help. And so I did. I went into therapy, and big proponent for mental health, major mental health advocate. Um, and from there, I've been able to develop, even through my counseling sessions, been giving recommendations, meditation, and how to get better at that, because meditation can be so intimidating, right? Especially when your thoughts are like all over the place. But through therapy, I was able to hone in on the right way to do that. And then develop a routine that was going to work for me, that was going to help me continue to renew my mind every day, and help me through the difficult challenges. Because even through healing and recovery, there are still going to be days when you're triggered, and there are still going to be days when you have some difficulties. And the important thing is developing that practice that helps us hone in on those things that are going to help us move past those difficult moments.
Agreed, agreed. And I think we are all, in a sense, on our own individual journeys because for those of us who are broken, and when we recognize that we are broken and we take the intentional steps forward, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty because it's all unknown. You are becoming something brand new. And so that's the beauty of the transformation. That's the beauty of your healing. I've got to ask, what was that most pivotal, other than the decision to change through your healing journey? What was one of the more pivotal moments that you knew you were different? Can you share that?
So this question has come up recently, and I've really been thinking about it because I have a another a psychotherapist friend of mine that I've met through social networks recently, who read my book, and he said to me, I wonder if your resilience, if you were born with it or if you learned it, that nature versus nurture, argument or that conversation. And the more I think about that, because it's so difficult for me to explain how, as young as a child, and even having gone through some abuse of my own, some sexual abuse as a child, um, how I was still able. I literally said to myself, I am not going to be a victim as like an 8, 9, 10 year old, and how that came to me. And I'm sure Oprah had something to do with it. Um, but I said, I am not. And so that was part of how I was able to gain some of that power. So I think in so many ways, obviously our environment has a lot to do with it. I saw the strength within my mother and what she was experiencing, what she was going through. So certainly I think I definitely held on to a lot of that. But sometimes I wonder, wow, I'm even, when I take a look back and I see people struggling that in my community, and people that I work with, how it's difficult for some people. And that's partly why I wanted to write this book, so that people can see that there's a possibility in pushing past your self perceived limitations.
So let's talk about your book just for a little bit, please. What is the main focus of the book? What did you want to get across to the reader? And
Mhm.
how are you yourself? It's a lot of questions. How are you transformed by the writing of your book?
Yes. So the main purpose of my book was certainly to share my story to help others heal. But primarily, I wanted to not just share my story, I wanted to be able to leave people with coping skills, and a way to start to get there, in order to deal with those maternal heartaches, and the things that they experience in life that sometimes make it difficult within the mother-daughter relationships. And I would even argue to say it's not just mother-daughter, but I know many husbands who have wives of my husband, definitely, who has experienced, this kind of pain, and so they want to be able to help their wives through it, help their siblings through it. Ultimately, that is my goal, the overall purpose of the book. And how I was changed by the writing of my book. um, it definitely made me really tap into my vulnerability. Vulnerability, as you can imagine, being a focused and determined and dedicated and perfectionist, personality. Vulnerability was not anything ever I wanted to
Was
feel.
not in your vocabulary at all.
No, no. If anything, I saw that as a sign of weakness. And I realized through my healing journey, and through the writing of the book and the promoting of the book, especially because there are moments of vulnerability that come up within every conversation as I'm discussing it, and being open to sharing that, because there is a greater purpose, right? My life is lived not just for me but for others as well. And so I feel like, what am I doing keeping all of these experiences to myself that I know can bless someone else and help someone else through a difficult time?
There's a deeper story in those last words that you said, but I don't have time to uncover it today.
Yeah,
I would like for you to come back on my podcast called Coach's Corner so we can talk about how you do actually help others. But before we leave this conversation, if that's okay with you,
absolutely. I would love it.
before we leave this conversation, can you give our watching and listening audience something to do, something if they're kind of stuck in their own relationship, tragic as it may be, with their mom, dad, with their parent, or with other somebody else of meaning and importance,
Mhm.
and they're really struggling with that relationship. Can you can you give them a message of hope, please?
Yes. The biggest message I can give in a circumstance like that is to be honest with yourself, with what you're feeling and why you're feeling it. Understanding that first before you decide to open up a conversation with a loved one, because we understand that oftentimes us sharing how we feel may not always be perceived in the right way, and so you want to be able to have the correct language to approach someone if you want to initiate that conversation. Definitely lesson learned on my end with my mother and in my relationships. So I would certainly take the time to get to know yourself, to really sit in the feelings of your hurt and your disappointment, and understand where that comes from, what's the root of that, and explore that in order to then open yourself up to better relationships and better possibilities.
This has been a very blessed conversation. I do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
So, for those of you who have been watching and listening, I'll see you next time. Take care.